The history of Britain since about 1750. That was the period of the Industrial Revolution, which began in England, the spinning jenny, which revolutionized textile manufacturing, and Watt's steam engine. These were English inventions. The American Revolution occurred at this time. The voyages of Captain James Cook are interesting because he basically discovered New Zealand for the British Empire and started mapping the coast of Australia. Britain also fought France in the French Revolutionary Wars, which lasted for a decade. Britain merged with Ireland in 1801 to form the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland now, and that was when the Union Jack flag, the Union Jack is this flag that everybody knows today, that was designed at that point. Britain also fought Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars, which followed the French Revolutionary Wars. It was when Napoleon had become the leader of France. And they, of course, beat him at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. Queen Victoria is definitely a monarch you should know the name of. She gave name to the period, which is called then Victorian Britain. This was the rise of industrial society with its trains and steamships and great advances in science and engineering with many prominent British people. Michael Faraday, for instance, famous for his research into electricity, invented the first electric generator. Charles Darwin, of course, with his theory of evolution by natural selection. And this is Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone. He was Scottish. Charles Dickens' social novel Oliver Twist is about poverty, urban poverty in Victorian Britain. This was the time of the birth of party politics. The Conservative Party and the Liberal Party were both founded at that point. The Labour Party came a little bit later. This is Cecil Rhodes, who was a major colonial empire builder in Africa, but the British also expanded in their Asian colonies. This is the map of the British Empire in 1914, presumed to be when it was at its largest, but actually 1919 is when it was at its largest extent because that was after World War I and Britain confiscated, as it were, some German colonies. Anyway, at this point, the British Empire covered a quarter, 1/4 of the world's land surface and 1/5 of the people. The largest colonial empire ever. Canada, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand were, in the time of Victoria or shortly after, given home rule that they could rule themselves. These are countries that had some white settlers, so these were sort of the white colonies. These are the old flags, by the way, of Canada and South Africa. They have new ones now, while Australia and New Zealand have retained their old colonial flags. New Zealand may have a new flag at some point in the future, though. But of course, there were also indigenous peoples in these colonies, and here are some of the ones currently in the English-speaking world. There were Native Americans, of course, in British North American colonies, but the British, in fact, with the so-called Proclamation Line of 1763, did not intend to colonize any further westward of these 13 original colonies. They didn't want to expand into Native American lands. Of course, later the United States did that anyway, of course. Canada also has a native population. They're called Aboriginal people, but can be further subdivided into these three groups. The First Nations, there are many of those, and the Inuit, which are the Arctic natives, formerly called Eskimos. And this French word métis, métis, I think, which is just a French word for mixed, mixed race, people who are mixed of Aboriginal and white generally. And there are, of course, the Australian Aboriginals, sometimes called Aborigines, and Torres Strait Islands, by the way, a group of islands north of this tip here off the coast of Australia. they see themselves as separate from the Australian Aboriginals and call themselves Torres Strait Islanders. And the Maori people, of course, of New Zealand, who are Polynesian. That means that they are related to the native population of Hawaii, for instance, and French Polynesia. Britain in the 20th century now, of course, Britain was one of the major powers involved in World War I, on the winning side, of course. The Irish War of Independence, that is when Ireland fought to become separate from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and therefore, after this, once Ireland received their home rule and were allowed to become separate, but of course then Northern Ireland was retained, and since then we speak of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, of course. Britain fought in World War II with here President Franklin D. Roosevelt of the United States and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. They fought against the Nazis, of course, and this is Winston Churchill, the famous conservative Prime Minister of Britain at that time. The British Empire no longer exists, and that is because of decolonization. The colonies became separate states. It started with India in 1947, which also separated into India and Pakistan shortly thereafter. The final one was Hong Kong in 1997, which is now part of the People's Republic of China. Britain still has a few colonies remaining, but they are basically very, very small, mostly islands, and they're called dependent territories. The British welfare state is significant. Already in 1948, they got their NHS, National Health Service, taxpayer-funded universal health care, government-run, and both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party agreed on these welfare state measures. That's called the post-war consensus, that they agreed on taking the country in this direction. The troubles in Northern Ireland was the almost civil war-like conflict there between Irish Catholic separatists who wanted Northern Ireland to become part of Ireland and their opponents, the Loyalists. Both groups had basically terrorist groups affiliated with them, and many people died or were injured throughout these 3 decades of conflict. Margaret Thatcher is the first female Prime Minister of Britain and a very famous Prime Minister. Tony Blair was the later one in the 1990s and early 2000s. These Prime Ministers represented 2 different parties. Thatcher was a conservative, while Tony Blair was a member of the Labour Party. And while Margaret Thatcher took the Conservatives more to the right, Tony Blair took Labour more to the center. Anyway, thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed it. Catch my next videos on American history if you're interested in that.